Okay, so this week we're going to talk about the revolutions and insurgency groups and civil wars in Latin America. So we're going to try to investigate or to look into the context that give rise to these movements and the processes by which these insurgency or guerrilla movements manage to sustain their actions throughout or over a long period of time and across different countries, and why these actions led to different trajectories or different outcomes. From successful outcome by these insurgency or guerrilla movements seized power in some contexts, and while in others they failed and actually led to like a long period of civil war with the incumbent or the ruling elites in some countries, while in others, the ruling elites or the elite circle actually aborted or put down these movements from the very beginning. So, as I mentioned last lecture, in Central America, this period of agrarian reform and the radicality of the radical orientation of the liberal governments actually led to deep class struggles or polarization that actually led to peasants' revolts mainly in El Salvador and Guatemala. But actually, the military rulers managed, or the old elite circle or the old elite, the old incumbents managed to quell these revolts and to establish their authoritarian governance or authoritarian rule. So the context got a little bit different after the revolution in Cuba. So what happened? It gave like an example of epic victory of the popular revolutions or the popular or the mass uprisings that actually culminated into a revolution and a complete takeover or a complete seizure of power. So this actually inspired other movements or revolutionary groups in Latin America in order to follow in the same steps in order to undertake their revolutionary actions in the hope of seizing power or overthrowing like the old elite incumbent and to establish a new kind of political regime. So it actually the revolution in Cuba offered them like a standard in order to be followed, not only through like these kind of sustainable military action, but also this kind of repertoire of revolutionary ideas and symbols that managed to recruit some supporters over a long period of time, as I mentioned, and then eventually led to a successful revolution, and like the revolutionary forces managed to take over power. So this week we're trying to put this in comparative perspective, what kind of context that or social and economic conditions that actually stimulated or did encourage these revolutionary movements to emerge, and why, what kind of processes or dynamics we need to look into, or the causal mechanisms we need to unravel in order to understand these dynamic processes, and then how it led to different outcomes with like successful revolutionary forces reaching power in Nicaragua and in Cuba first, and then in Nicaragua, and then cases of civil war or a failure of revolutionary or insurgency groups in Guatemala, El Salvador, Colombia, and to some extent Venezuela and Bolivia. So basically in 1959, Fidel de Castro, with his movement, 22nd of July movement, managed to take over power. And then Sandinista in 1979 as well managed to overthrow or to put an end to this Somoza dynasty. So these are like two main successful cases that would be representative of successful revolutionary or insurgency groups that managed to take over power in Latin America, while in other countries, as I mentioned, these groups failed, and it led to prolonged civil war or instability and violence in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Colombia, with the very presence or the existence of strong guerrilla groups and like recruitable pool of peasants. So they managed to appeal to wide masses, but they didn't manage to take over power. So that led to kind of hegemonic crisis, and they were not able to establish or to erode the legitimacy of the old regimes. And that's why this led to a period of long civil war. So we will try, after like giving some sort of facts and some sort of like historical overview on these revolutionary processes and different outcomes. We need to understand the causal mechanisms and these kind of ideational and socioeconomic conditions that actually sustained or expanded these movements across different countries in the 60s and 70s. And then we need to situate this in the broader international context, because we cannot relegate or we cannot marginalize the United States, the role of the United States, especially in supporting, even with like direct intervention or supporting financially and transfer, like by transferring some military aid to counter-revolutionary movements in order to undermine, to erode the legitimate basis of these revolutionary groups or guerrilla groups. So the representative case of like successful revolution was Cuba. So like Batista took over power in a coup in 1930. And he tried as well to take over power again one more time in 1953 through a coup, in order to actually to prevent a possible electoral defeat. So one of the frustrated candidate, Fidel de Castro, he actually organized attack on the military barracks Moncada, but he failed. And that's why the dictatorship or the incumbent elite managed actually to encircle them and to send them to prison and force them into exile. And Castro made his way back to Cuba in 1956 in order to organize and actually he kind of organized these kind of guerrilla centers away from the urban centers. So he actually made his way to the eastern hills in order to establish these guerrilla centers and to offer them kind of sustainable training in order to launch his attack on the dictatorship and the targets of the Batista's regime. And he actually formed or created this M26 movement, and by 1958 the movement actually expanded to urban centers as well. So it managed to recruit wide masses and expanded from their initial rural areas or rural centers to urban centers as well, in order to attract some other elements from the urban movements. So actually, by attracting these wide masses, the movement managed to take over power by the end of 1958, and then actually forced the dictatorship to flee the country. In roughly 2 years, Castro managed to institutionalize the revolution, and actually he framed it as a socialist one by the mid 1961. But it actually concealed the very nature of the cross-class alliance the M26 actually established in order to expand its social basis and to attract adherents from different classes and from different geographical areas. So actually he appealed as well to, the movement actually appealed to some bourgeoisie elements and in urban centers. And so it was not totally reducible to this class struggle or working classes or peasants, but it actually it included in the very beginning, from the very beginning, in its early stages, it included some bourgeoisie elements as well. But it was later framed as a socialist revolution in order to undertake, this kind of far-reaching social and economic transformation of the society, and to actually to handle or to offer solution or remedy for poverty and social injustice. So like revolutionary leaders actually celebrated the success of the revolution in Cuba for several reasons, because it actually it was kind of like revolutionary groups or guerrilla movements or centers, they didn't wait for permissible conditions in order to undertake their acts, but actually they created, these kind of revolutionary crisis or revolutionary situation. So it offered, some like positive example to popular movements in the continent, that these popular masses had the ability, with this kind of epic victory of the popular will. So they offered some sort of a positive case for other countries or for other revolutionary movements to follow the same steps or the same kind of rules in order to achieve their to fulfill their revolutionary demands. So it actually it managed to achieve kind of a defeat in the face of regular military forces or regular military power of Batista, or of the dictatorship or of the authoritarian regime. So it actually a triumph of popular will and assertion of the will of the masses or the popular masses, that they actually they had the power over their own destiny, and they can through sustainable acts, they can defeat authoritarianism or military power. And it actually like the Castro didn't start with the urban movements or the urban centers in order to dismantle the old authoritarian structure, or to force the dictatorship to flee, but actually he started. He actually used these kind of rural centers in order to create to create the conditions by which urban movements could join in the M26 movement. So instead of waiting for like permissible environment or conducive environment or conditions to be to allow them to take these revolutionary acts, they actually created through these kind of guerrilla centers in rural areas or remote areas, and they managed actually to expand and to expand the movement to the urban centers, and managed to take over power eventually. So it actually the movement also like destroyed, this stereotypical image about how to undertake, a successful, or to make a successful, what would make a successful revolution. So instead of starting with urban areas or urban centers, they managed to create, this kind of revolutionary zeal in the countryside or in the very remote areas in the country, and then expanded to different urban centers. So the role of ideology or ideological forces as well were essential in undertaking any kind of revolutionary act. Um, so they offered, like, instead of following or playing the game from within or playing with the rules of the game that laid down upon them by these authoritarian regimes, they actually violated this constitutional legality and without exhaustion of this civic resistance. So they managed to resort to direct action or military acts in order to undertake their or to implement their revolutionary ideas. So by actually creating or shifting, this kind of popular consciousness and creating these kind of revolutionary or instilling these kind of revolutionary ideas in society and attracting wide masses, they created different notions or different culture, different revolutionary culture that actually stimulated people to sacrifice in the name of the revolution and to have a kind of self-determination and to have like the will to establish a more just social order. So they created what they called this kind of dual legitimacy by transforming their initial unconventional guerrilla warfare or means of fighting to conventional or to acquire the main characteristics of the conventional army or the military establishment. So they actually they eroded this the monopoly of the state over legitimate use of violence, because now they acquired the same features or the characteristics of conventional army, and they attracted some masses that they did believe in their right to govern or to rule. So they actually eroded, this kind of the legitimacy of the dictatorship regime through spreading one factor by like spreading, these kind of revolutionary ideas and maintaining this kind of ideological zeal or the ideological force in order to recruit or to secure like a constant source of or a constant channel for recruitment. So they managed, to create this kind of dual legitimacy that eventually stripped the national government of its power or legitimate right to govern or to rule, and then eventually it facilitated their takeover or seizure of power. Another archetypal case is Nicaragua as well, of these kind of revolutionary transformation, but it happened like 20 years later in 1979. So if you remember when we discussed Mahoney article on path dependency, what happened in Central America, except for Costa Rica, like the other countries failed miserably to undertake these kind of, or to shift to make this kind of radical shift politically. And this led to like the installation or enactment of traditional authoritarianism in Nicaragua and Honduras, and military dictatorship in Guatemala and El Salvador. So what happened in Nicaragua after roughly like 40 years of the dominance of Somoza dynasty or family over the political system, after their like control over society and political and this kind of after closing this kind of political system and denying any kind of admission to different social forces to the political process, Sandinista as a guerrilla group managed to sustain their guerrilla actions in order to topple or to overthrow eventually, or to put an end to this traditional family rule. So with this emergence of new actors like Sandinista, so they had to appeal or to attract wide masses by offering them a viable political alternative and different kind of ideational framework that would attract wide masses to their to join in or to sustain their struggle against these kind of old power centers. So they had like this kind of existing contradictions, social and economic contradictions. So they had to undertake a revolutionary or to implement some kind of revolutionary and radical policies in order to transform the society economically, socially, politically, and militarily. Like Sandinista movement appealed to wide masses, and by making this kind of adherence to anti-imperialism, as I mentioned last lecture as well, the United States had long treated Nicaragua as kind of it had like kind of a direct occupation, but it had long treated it as one of its colony as well. So they developed this anti-imperialist discourse and national liberation ideology in order to teach people that they have the right for self-determination, and they have the right to emancipate themselves or to liberate themselves from this imperial power. And they actually had their own notion of popular democracy as well, by creating these kind of civil militias and popular army alongside or along with these kind of traditional democratic institutions like national parliament, elections, and party systems. So they tried to offer like different ideologies or different cultural frame that the main components were based or centered on this anti-imperialism or national liberation and social and political emancipation as well, in order to have like control over their own destiny on the one hand, and to have a more just social order on the other. So that's why it was like, in order to be true to these revolutionary ideals or ideology, and to have kind of sustainability from generation to another, or to maintain the same power or the same motive from or sustainable kind of social basis, in order to fend off or to mitigate any kind of counter-revolutionary actions. So Sandinista groups or Sandinista government had to undertake, this kind of radical process of social and political transformation, that it actually took roughly 7 years in order to transform the society radically. So economically, the state played like important role in economic sector. So the state established its control over resources and planning and allocation of resources, and it had to undertake some sort of far-reaching agrarian reform by distributing large tracts of lands to peasants, in order to be true to their ideas about social justice and economic equality. And politically, in order to discipline masses and to guarantee this kind of loyalty of different groups or different political groups to the revolutionary ideas or to Sandinista government, so they created this kind of corporate structure and political parties in order to integrate, the masses into these mass organizations and unions and popular unions. And as I mentioned, militarily, the United States transferred, some kind of military aids and different other, like, training programs of counter-revolutionary movements that actually they were placed on Pacific and Atlantic coasts. So that's why Sandinista government had to deal differently with these groups in order to avoid any kind of physical exhaustion. So it had like to establish a kind of loyal forces from loyal civilian forces in order to train them in military acts and to how to defend, the how to sacrifice and how to defend, to defend the revolution, or to fight for these revolutionary ideas. So they created, this popular army and civilian militias in order to to counterweight this kind of funding and training from the United States to the counter-revolutionary movement. But that was like force was not enough. So they had to pay attention to these kind of educational institutions as well, and how to sustain, you know, this to maintain this enthusiasm to revolutions or revolutionary ideas, or the Sandinista revolutionary frame. So that's why, again, they had to downplay, you know, this kind of class structure and this kind of socialism or Marxism, in order to attract different potential sympathizers, you know, from a progressive sector in the church, the liberation theology, that people, the advocates of the liberation theology. And actually they attracted, you know, some other elements, like dissatisfied or disaffected groups in society, that they don't actually, mainly from Christians or non-Marxists, that they don't actually believe in Marxism, but they do believe in this social order and political emancipation. And because one of the main pillar of their or one of the main content of their ideology, so Sandinistas had to prove that the government really or genuinely believed in this self-determination. So they had to offer some space for indigenous and racial communities to preserve their own culture. So like they offered this kind of some sort of cultural autonomy through bilingual educational system to Blacks and indigenous communities, in order to maintain their or to win them over to the side of the Sandinistas, and to avoid any kind of alignment between them and counter-revolutionary movements. So they had to contain, you know, these kind of counter-revolutionary groups with the help of the United States, by deploying non-military, by deploying some sort of different strategies, that these strategies are not limited to military forces, or using, you know, power or force in order to quell any potential counter-revolutionary act. So they had to pay attention to the education, to the educational system, and to the existence of different sides of ideological struggles. So mainly it came from these educational institutions. So they had to instill these kind of revolutionary ideas that stimulate or encourage people to believe in social justice, self-determination, and political liberation. And the church as well, they expelled the conservative hierarchy in the Catholic Church, in order to put an end to this dissemination of social conservatism, or instilling, you know, these social conservatism ideas into society. So they radically transformed, like the society by taking different actions, or fighting on different fronts, not only militarily, but also like ideologically or educationally and economically and politically as well, in order to establish or to consolidate and to institutionalize their revolution. So like looking into these successful cases, in order to investigate or to examine like successful revolutions or revolutionary behavior, so it was like kind of a constellation of some historical events that gave rise to these revolutionary crises, and then with the help of some socioeconomic conditions, this actually led to the emergence, as Cockpel mentioned, you know, this kind of revolutionary crisis emerged rather than created. So that's why it's a debate, and we can, like, toward the end of this lecture, or perhaps at the next one, we can like look into this kind of interaction between structure and agency in order to plausibly explain successful revolutions or different outcomes of insurgency actions. But mainly, if you need to investigate or to examine, these types of insurgency acts or revolutionary acts, so you need to map out the players, who are the combatants. So in the case of Cuba and Nicaragua, like Sandinista or M26, with the help of some other, bourgeoisie and even bureaucratic elements from the state apparatus, they helped, they actually got attracted or absorbed into these revolutionary ideals in order to erode the legitimate basis of the traditional authoritarian rulers. So you need to pay attention to the sides, or who are the fighters, to map out the main players, and then the target of these acts. Because if they don't appeal to masses, if they don't fight for people, so they don't attract, some wide support in order to sustain their insurgency actions. As Guevara actually noted, so the difference between these kind of guerrilla warfare or guerrilla groups and gangs of bandits, they had like the same kind of military structure, like discipline, force, this kind of knowledge of the terrain, and this kind of sustainability of sustainability of military acts or violent acts through non-conventional means. But the difference is, like, these kind of revolutionary or guerrilla groups in Latin America, they try to capitalize on the social cause, or to attract wide masses in order to fight in their names. So they actually they claimed kind of representation of these masses. So they had to adopt some sort of strategies and deploy some sort of tools that would help these masses, to join the struggle. So by attracting, these social basis or wide masses to the struggle, so you need to pay attention to the size of the population that involved in these revolutionary or insurgency acts. If they manage to attract, wide masses, so they sustain and they manage to sustain their revolutionary act or insurgency act over a long period of time, with some sort of acquiring, as I mentioned, this kind of conventional characteristics of military capacity. So they would create this kind of dual legitimacy, and having like considerable size of the population, that they genuinely, or they do believe in their right to govern, or their rightful rule. And the geographical domains, how they expanded actually their insurgency acts or insurrectional or military operation to basically urban centers, or wide geographical areas, in order to disseminate, these kind of revolutionary ideals and attract more supporters or adherents to their cause. And then after, even after reaching power or taking over power through occupying these kind of power center and coercive, having control over, these kind of coercive capacity as well, the coercive apparatuses, in order to have this kind of coercive capacity and the legitimate use of these military force to discipline masses or to establish stability and order. So they had to politically institutionalize, these revolutionary acts as well, in order to avoid any revolutionary dogmatism, and to discipline masses, or like it was kind of indoctrination, but through this kind of educational system or educational institution. But they had to believe in these kind of ideological content or ideological forces in order to maintain their support to the or to maintain to sustain this revolutionary the revolutionary legitimacy of these kind of regimes. And actually that was happened in Nicaragua and Cuba. So I'm just thinking like they haven't, like, no other cases, managed to reach, this stage of, like, a discipline or well disciplined, military force that was about to take over power, and then they didn't manage to institutionalize, these revolutions. But what happened in Cuba and Nicaragua, they managed actually to institutionalize this on several levels, like politically and educationally, and socially as well, in order to maintain this kind of revolutionary zeal and to absorb, different generations into these revolutionary ideas. So what happened in other cases? As I mentioned last week, Guatemala and El Salvador, they witnessed, this prolonged period of military authoritarianism after, like, this kind of aborted period of liberal transformation. So in 19 from the reformist period, came to an end in 1954. So it was like a vacillation between different sorts of radical and gradual reform policies in order to satisfy peasants or social bases. But this kind of reforms period came to an end in 1954, and in an operation with the help of the CIA and the intervention of the United States in order to overthrow Arbins, that actually undertook this kind of social transformation measures, or like agrarian reform measures that actually threatened the United States interest in Guatemala. So that's why they had to put an end to any kind of redistributive policies and any kind of radicalization of the peasants, and to preserve their like the economic interest of the American companies in Guatemala. So this after like after this intervention from the United States, what happened? It was like a series of authoritarian rulers that actually ran the country, and it was like a different period, or like oscillation between like hit and run between guerrilla groups and the ruling elites, and with the help of the United States. Or the support for counter-revolutionary or counter-guerrilla movements. So what happened? Even like factions from the military, tried to take over power in order to usher in more kind of just or equal social and economic policies. But these kind of attempts got aborted. The most famous one was the left-leaning military revolt in 1960. So this actually it helped, like, stimulated some guerrilla movements to gain kind of ground in some areas in order to fight for the social and economic cause. So this actually gave rise to the movement, the Revolutionary Movement 13, and the rebel armed forces that actually gained some sort of ground in the northeastern part in 1965. But after 2 years, actually the ruling elites, or the predominant military forces, managed to clear to undertake military operation in order to quell or to put an end to these guerrilla actions. And the far again, the rebel armed forces re-emerged again in 1970, and this time amongst the Indians in the Western Highlands, in order to undertake these kind of trying to attract, some peasants or some recruiters in order to sustain their violent acts against the dictator. Again, the dictatorship or the authoritarian regime, and different other, but they haven't managed to throughout this period to establish like one guerrilla movement or one force that would represent these white masses. So this kind of, they lack this inter-military solidarity and a unified military force in order to sustain their struggle against the old authoritarianism or the traditional military authoritarian regimes. So that was like after this kind of stalemated situation between like guerrilla movements and conventional or regular armed forces, they managed actually to put an end or to actually clear some areas. They had some sort of concentration in these areas, mainly through the Rius Mount military operation in 1982. But they actually they maintained some sort of presence, until throughout the 80s, and then the government, by undertaking these kind of like legitimate programs of or proposal for elections and some sort of political reforms in order to meet some of the peasants' demands. So they outmaneuvered these guerrilla movements. So the government program of elections, it offered some sort of legitimacy, and it prevented these guerrilla movements from undermining or eroding the legitimate foundation of the Guatemalan or the old ruling elite in Guatemala. So it actually the civilian president was elected and assumed power in 1985, and it was actually it approached like a point of no return. So now like the government, like a civilian president, had some sort of electoral legitimacy, and now they had kind of functioning democratic institutions in order to absorb or to represent the masses or to represent these demands through these institutional channels. So that's why it helped these the governments or these regimes to frame the any kind of guerrilla acts as or guerrilla groups as terrorists that actually they terrified civilians, and that's why they had to undertake some sort of repressive actions against them, legitimate repressive actions against them, and then they were forced to have like these kind of peace talks or ceasefire agreement with the legitimate government in Guatemala, and that actually replicated itself and was roughly the same in El Salvador. Long period of this kind of hegemonic crisis between different combatants, like no party had the ability to inflict, this decisive military defeat, and that's why eventually the government outmaneuvered them by establishing electoral legitimate foundation, and then the government forced them to have these kind of peace talks and ceasefire agreements. So El Salvador as well, like these kind of traditional authority or traditional authoritarian rule sustained itself from 1930 through the 70s. But like during that period, the 70s, it was like the very like a strong period that gave rise to these guerrilla groups in El Salvador against the brutality and the closed political system in El Salvador. So they started to unravel or to decay. These kind of the military rule started to decay slowly in the 70s, and this actually gave some sort of some sort of power to guerrilla groups, but they were internally fragmented or severely like torn apart from inside. So you cannot speak of like one guerrilla group that actually where the guerrilla movements, the one guerrilla movement that was actually in charge of initiating or organizing or training, different groups, or recruited different like peasants or popular actors into their military operation. So it was like hardly to speak of like one guerrilla group that was in charge of these kind of violent or what they call the revolutionary acts, as it happened in Cuba or Sandinista in Nicaragua. So the most prominent ones were Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, that emerged in 1970, and it actually splintered from the Communist Party. So it was like these kind of opposition or violent opposition. Actually, they were deeply fragmented from within, and this actually manifested itself in different organizational forms of these groups. So that was the National Liberation Front, Farabundo. And then the Revolutionary Army of the People, and it contained, some of the Christians and communists as well, and it emerged in 1971. And as a faction from the Revolutionary Army of the People, ERP, the Armed Forces of National Resistance actually emerged as a faction from ERP. And eventually, by the end of in 1979, 1981, they managed to reorganize these fragmented guerrilla groups, managed to reorganize themselves into one movement, and they joined actually Farabundo National Liberation Front in order to take, this to lead, their struggle against the Romero government and against, this kind of traditional authoritarian elites, broadly speaking. But actually, they failed to topple, the military, the civilian military junta in 1979, and again, the government managed to outmaneuver or to actually put an end, to undermine, the social basis of these movements by electing a constituent assembly in 1982. So now they had like legitimate institutional channel in order to speak on behalf of the people, and they have like the legislative and the presidential elections as well in 84 and 85, and that's how they actually eventually they pushed or obliged the Farabundo National Liberation Front in order to sit at the negotiation table and to have these kind of peace talks and ceasefire agreement with the government. So there are some other cases that failed in establishing revolutionary government or to take over power in different areas in the region as well. Like Bolivia, from the very beginning, they didn't attract, they didn't manage to attract some supporters from peasants. So the first stage to gain, these kind of support from masses and then to expand to different constituents, they failed miserably to meet, or to achieve this stage before establishing well-trained and disciplined, military forces, or to have well-disciplined military hierarchy and operations. In Venezuela as well. So Betancourt put an end to Jimenez government in 1958 with the Action Democratic Party, with the cooperation from Action Democratic Party and some democratic faction or reformist faction in the military as well. They managed to reinstall some sort of competitive political regime in Venezuela in the late 50s. So what happened, like some factions from the Democratic Action Party and some left-leaning students and communists and some other leftist forces, they were dissatisfied with the austerity policies and the social and economic policies of the Action Democratic parties. So they tried to attract, some supporters or to recruit, some masses against and to organize rebellion against Betancourt. But actually they failed from the very beginning, because like the Democratic Action Party took some sort of or undertook some sort of measures in order to satisfy peasants and popular classes, and that's why they actually prevented um, these rebellious forces from penetrating society and attracting or recruiting a wide support base. In Colombia as well, it was like a closed political system. If you remember from the first week and the second week, we talked about these kind of traditional party system that has been dominated by the conservative and the liberals. So what happened after it was like the society, it has been common to witness this kind of violence and political assassination in Colombia. So that's why these two parties were in charge of restoring this kind of political equilibrium by having some sort of pact or power sharing pact between them. So what happened in the late 40s, the assassination of one of the political figure from the Liberal Party, it gave rise to a period of a violent period of political instability and the establishment of authoritarian or dictatorship regime in Colombia until the late 50s. So that's why it led to this period called La Violencia, the violence, that actually it was like a severe like civilian conflict between different elements in the society, and this helped some peasants to form their republics and to organize their rebellious actions against the national government during that period. So that's why the liberal and the conservative parties, they managed to get together in order to sign the National Front Pact, in order to have a kind of agreement on the terms of alternation of power, the distribution of ministerial posts, and how to clear, the country of these peasants' republics and any pockets of potential political rebellion. So from these peasants' republics, the FARC and the communist parties actually emerged, and they managed to every now and then, to have these kind of rebellious and violent acts against the national government or the established pattern of authority, but they never managed to take over power. They never managed to establish, this to acquire this the characteristics of the conventional army, especially with the what complicated, the process is the drug traffickers or the that actually played important role in feeding into these kind of civilian conflict or like civilian struggle in Colombia, as we are going to see in a few weeks. So it was like a complicated political and social scene in Colombia that FARC and like any other armed groups actually didn't manage to establish their hegemonic position that actually prolonged the period of the civil war there. Now, we have this context of apported social and economic transformation and the endurance of traditional ruling elites that actually gave rise to Sandinista and some other of guerrilla groups in Central America and helped them to emerge in order to fight for a social cause. or like it was like a closed political system that actually gave rise to these movements, and the denial of any sort of social and economic rights to the popular classes, and most especially peasants in these countries. So that was like the context, and the outcomes were different as well, with some successful revolutionary acts in Cuba and in Nicaragua, and the Sandinista and M26 and Fidel de Castro reached power. And in Nicaragua and in Guatemala and El Salvador, they actually failed to reach power, although they managed to sustain kind of constant channel of recruitment amongst the peasants. So they gained some sort of wide or considerable, peasant support, but they didn't manage, to acquire this, to monopolize, the legitimate use of violence in order to take over power and to shift, mass loyalty to their side. So how can we interpret, the processes by which these kind of guerrilla movements or initial insurgency actions led to different outcomes, with like successful cases and unsuccessful cases? Like Wickham Crowley, actually, one of the readings, he actually focuses mainly on three main factors that combine together in order to understand. You need to understand them, the three of them, in order to investigate plausibly the different trajectories or the different pathways of the insurgency groups or guerrilla warfare in Latin America. So politically, it has like, political dimension, which is social dimension, which is like the peasant support, and like this kind of military dimension. It's the military strength and the use of violence and the how to occupy, the power centers, and mainly the coercive apparatuses. And then politically, how to acquire the loyalty of the masses, to shift, their loyalty from the traditional political authority to the new revolutionary government or way of governance. So when it comes to socially, like the support of the peasants, because these movements, they actually emerged in order to fight for or to represent, these the dissatisfied social classes, and mainly peasants. But for him, it was like a necessary condition, but not sufficient one, in order to have a sustainable and successful revolutionary act. Like Guatemala and Salvador, as I mentioned, and to some extent Colombia, they managed to recruit wide or to gain, wide support in rural areas, but they failed, to sustain them, or they failed to take over power. So it was like one of the necessary conditions that they actually they claim that they fight for people, so people have to respond to them in order to be recruited as as a combatant, to be recruited as combatants, like full-time combatant, or a temporary militia, for example. So they had to support them in a way or another in order to legitimize their representative claim. So in these countries, what happened, it was like the political leadership actually established this kind of alliance with even large landowners, latifundistas in Latin America. So that's why it's not reducible to this socialism and class struggle, because they appealed to or they mapped onto the pre-existing power relations in rural areas by attracting some sort of support from upper classes as well, not only peasants. So there was kind of intellectual or the intelligentsia that they had this kind of revolutionary ideas, and then they had this kind of alliance between these intellectual leaders and some sort of some element, some bourgeoisie element, and rank and file, and peasants and rank and file as well. So they attracted, different supporters in order to establish this multi-class alliance with this kind of ideational underpinning or revolutionary ideas that would stimulate and motivate their or determine somehow their course of action. So what would make peasants, or what would push peasants to support these radical leaders, or these kind of radical movements or guerrilla movements? There are like different kind of support, or different proportion of support as well. So peasants had to, or some of them actually showed, their support for radical movements or these kind of revolutionary leaders by offering, some information about, the existence of some elements related to the government as well, where the government had like a strong system of surveillance in these areas. They might offer competence with food supplies, not only information, like material supplies as well, or they might present themselves as available channel for of recruitment for their armies, either full-time or part-time, as I mentioned. So it was like the different forms of support they offered, but what kind of factors that actually determined, these this sort of peasant support? So the agrarian structure as well, it was very important. When peasants they found themselves in a zero-sum game with landowners, basically colonizers, that like peasants that used to colonize or some lands, so that was like the only source for their to advance their material livelihood. So the engaged or sharecroppers as well. So one of the like as I mentioned, like coffee sector, and then the sugar and cotton as well. One of the most prominent, sectors, that it was like one of the main sources for peasants to live. So any kind of reduction in prices of these in these crops, and any kind of forced displacement or migration of laborers from one zone to area to another zone, from one area to another. So that actually the peasants actually found themselves in this zero-sum game with the landed elites. So the land was the only source for them to live, or to have some to drive some material benefits. But in other like sugar plantation, for example, it was like the capital was a different source, because now like the landowners, they had different sources in order to reach a compromise. So it's not a zero, it's a non-zero sum game with the cultivators. So they reached kind of a compromise with peasants, because they have, through different kind of investment, through different kind of job, offering some sort of job opportunities or different investment to divide, the income between them and the cultivators. So they didn't find themselves, if there existed other sources of other sources, or other than other economic sources other than the land. So the peasants were inclined to de-radicalize, their movement, instead of getting absorbed into this radical and revolutionary ideals. If there is a kind of a dislocation or a zero-sum game between them, or a conflict between them and landed elites, so there are much more likely this structure more likely would radicalize peasants, or like the cultivators, in order to join the armed struggle. And the degree of dislocation as well, the state actions with regard to taking, this extra legal measures as an assault on landed security by expelling or evicting, peasants from their lands, and this led to like the displacement of peasants, made them like available or ripe for this kind of radical ideas or radicalization or radical political behavior. And it's like how to push peasants to move beyond these kind of material demands, this attachment only to the demands for lands, by actually drawing them into this kind of cultural repertoires, how to instill, this kind of revolutionary idea or indoctrinate them into these revolutionary thoughts or revolutionary ideas as kind of non-material demands as well. So they have, in order to join, these armed struggles, so they might sacrifice, their lives, or they might risk their lives in order to have a successful revolution. So it had to have like these guerrilla movements or revolutionary groups or leaders or intellectuals, they had to find a way in order to educate peasants or masses and to absorb or to internalize these kind of revolutionary ideas as well, in order to be ready to sacrifice in the name of the revolution. What would help them to do this was like a resource mobilization. If they had like this kind of sustainable channel to access and to recruit peasants through pre-existing party system and basically clientelistic networks in rural areas, it was there, and they established this paternalistic relationship with the peasants or with the popular masses. So it was much easier by drawing on these kind of organizational basis of political parties or these kind of clientelistic or paternalistic ties, how to use them in order to educate or to train peasants in different radical and revolutionary ideas as well, because they would join, or they would conform to they would receive and conform to the ideas, the radical ideas of these political parties that actually aligned themselves with the intellectuals and revolutionary leaders. Or the used, or the Catholic Church or the progressive faction. I'm not sure if I mentioned this here before or not. Like in the late 1969, was like a gathering of bishops. They managed to get together in order to reinterpret the Bible in order to favor the poor, and to denounce. They actually condemn the existing, exploitative structure without, without getting, pulled or dragged into this kind of Marxism, because there is kind of a division between non-religious, Marxist groups or leftist groups and liberation theology faction in the church. But they managed actually to have like a conference in order to reinterpret or to the Bible to favor the poor. So that's why the church actually, or the advocates of the liberation theology, managed to organize peasants into some sort of organizations, and to offer, to offer them avenues in order to organize themselves, or to have effective communication with the radical and revolutionary leaders through ecclesiastical based communities. So these networks, were established by the church, the Catholic Church, and by the advocates of liberation theology and progressive faction. So they used these kind of well known or renowned religious figures in order to to preach at peasants and to educate them how to fight for the rights, and then to radicalize, to have this kind of radical mindset, and then to join these armed groups in rural areas. So these kind of existing, clientelistic, partisan networks and the progressive faction in the church, they help to offer some sort of organizational channels for rebellion, for rebellious leaders and revolutionary leaders and intellectuals in order to recruit peasants and sustain their struggle against traditional ruling elites. But like this kind of social dimension was necessary, but was not sufficient, because El Salvador and Guatemala and Colombia as well, they managed to attract, this support from peasants groups, but they failed, to reach power and to establish some sort of military strength. So another crucial element or variable is the military, or how to have like a sustainable military force to sustain like military operations, or to sustain, the fight against the incumbent elites. So in these successful cases, they managed to have like some sort of funding and sustainable training, how to recruit in order to train the new recruiters in these kind of military operations and military equipment. They had to have like some sort of funding in order to sustain these kind of activities. So the military strength was another crucial variable. So it had like this kind of material element, like financial resources, in order to have like training programs and to sustain, this kind of trained recruitable basis. But it had like a non-material dimension as well, this kind of inter-military solidarity, that to have like, this kind of well-disciplined leadership structure, and how to hold together, these kind of different elements inside, this military hierarchy was essential in Cuba and Nicaragua, that they were actually they never actually divided decisively, that gave rise to different guerrilla movements, as it happened in El Salvador and Guatemala and Colombia as well. And like this kind of sustainable funding was essential, especially that, as I mentioned, the very presence, or the strong and heavy presence of the United States in Central America was remarkable, by supporting, counterinsurgency groups and transferring, some sort of financial aids, or offering military training programs to counterinsurgency movements that would actually offset or mitigate, the effect of the insurgency groups or guerrilla movements, as it happened prominently and most famously in Guatemala. And then like this kind of ideological force, or ideological foundation, that in order to hold, different elements together and to sustain, this kind of solidarity inside, the military structure. That happened in Cuba and Nicaragua. They offered, this kind of unified guerrilla that sustained over like a short period of struggle in the case of in the case of Cuba and in Nicaragua. Like they had to face, and it was a little bit longer in Nicaragua, but the actually this kind of unified struggle for a social cause and this kind of ideological force sustained their struggle against Batista or Somoza in Cuba and Nicaragua respectively. And then by having like this kind of social support base among peasants, and then the military strength that's sustainable, and ideological force that would sustain, these kind of military operation and guarantee loyalty and unity inside, the guerrilla movement or the group. so one of the crucial factors as well is the political one. In order to claim, the right to rule, or to have kind of legitimacy to rule, so they have to get an approval or a loyalty of the masses in order to rule them. So that's why, like, this kind of cross-class alliance, by drawing on different or getting together different elements in society, and even like penetrating, the state apparatuses by attracting, some bureaucrats, by establishing these kind of cross-class and multi-institutional support, Cuba and Nicaragua managed to fulfill or to achieve, this level of shifting in mass reality, and stripping, the old dictatorship of the right to rule. What happened in El Salvador, like in addition to these kind of divisions between different guerrilla movements or groups, they actually intensified or heightening a class struggle by asserting, too much, this Marxist ideology. So this alienated, some other elements in the church, especially, like, as I mentioned, in Salvador. These guerrilla groups, they managed to gain some sort of considerable support from peasants in rural areas, and actually the support of the church and the faction of the liberation theology, they actually offer them organizational channel to communicate and cooperate with peasants, and actually to counterweight the very existence of the elements of the government in order to supervise or to establish their own kind of surveillance system in the rural areas. So the existence of this faction of the Catholic Church was there for them, but this kind of divisions and ideological and heightening and intensifying this class struggle, this kind of class struggle, and reduce the whole struggle to class elements. It actually alienated, some factions from the church, and that's why, what happened. It was like it manifested itself in different other the appearance of different other organizations in order to represent their ideas, as like factions from communists and Christians. They formed, this kind of armed forces in order to distinguish themselves or to differentiate themselves from Marxists. By downplaying, this kind of Marxist discourse or rhetoric in Cuba and Nicaragua, they managed actually to tune out, this kind of social conservative elements, and to attract the progressive faction or the progressive camp of the Catholic Church, or the advocates of liberation theology, to their sides, and to sustain their struggle against the dictatorship or authoritarian rules. Other source is like how to disseminate, their revolutionary ideas, or impute, people with this kind of ideological ideas or ideological elements or content. So in Cuba and Nicaragua, they had kind of control, or they had some sort of media outlet to provide people with some sort of reliable information. And to actually to close, some media sources for counter-revolutionary forces, in order to prevent any flow of information to social actors. So, like, they have, like, this kind of how to make, their ideas or political campaigns knowable or visible to the masses, or to the potential recruitable forces. That was like through like controlling the information or media outlets, that it didn't happen, in other cases like Guatemala and Salvador. So it was like some sort of strategic choices of political leadership by downplaying, this kind of Marxist elements or Marxist discourse, or this kind of class struggle, and controlling information and disseminating revolutionary and ideological ideas to infiltrate society with these kind of revolutionary and radical ideas. It helped them to sustain, their military operation, and to have like a constant channel of recruitment and support amongst the peasants, and that actually helped them to reach power. And actually, the government, Batista and Somoza as well, they didn't have any kind of competing political program in order to outmaneuver the revolutionary and radical forces. So in other countries like Colombia, this kind of national pact, Guatemala and Salvador, by having this kind of elected constituent assembly and presidential and legislative elections as well, so they managed to reclaim these kind of political legitimacy and to divide, these kind of guerrilla groups, and it was much easier for them to contain fragmented, guerrilla groups, and to depict them as terrorists, that they actually frightened, civilians by their violent acts. So that's why the government re-established its own legitimacy in these countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, and Colombia, but it didn't happen. It did not, like the traditional ruling elites, they didn't offer any kind of competing proposal or policy programs that would undermine the support base or erode the support base of Castro or Sandinistas. Okay, so I'll stop there, and next time I'll talk more about what, like the factors or the scope, the conditions that would help understand successful and failed revolutions, and this kind of how to put them within this frame of a structural agency interaction, and then the global context and the international dimension, and what kind of role would be assigned to the United States in Latin America. Okay, that's all for today. Bye.